Even as Constantine VII was breathing his last on the 9th of November 959, preparations were underway for a new invasion of Crete. His previous attempt had ended in disaster a decade before, but such was the renewed confidence of Byzantium that it was on the attack again. The Eastern Roman Reconquista was not limited to the Aegean though, for Muslim power was in decline all across the empire's eastern flank. Indeed, that had been the case for decades. Some foes in the east still gave the Byzantines pause, none more so than Saif al-Dawla, the emir of Aleppo. But to face them, the empire was fielding the most brilliant squad of generals in its history. Although the army had always offered a path to power for power-hungry men, the glory of these conquests, the greatest since the days of Justinian, bathed the generals who achieved them in prestige and influence like never before. Juxtaposed against the generals was a familiar mix of weakness and strength from the ruling Macedonian dynasty. Constantine VII's death in 959 was followed 4 years later by that of his son, thrusting his young grandsons onto the throne. The enduring popularity of their family insulated the children from deposition, but did not protect them entirely. Someone would have to look after them, and the question on everyone's minds was who. Whether they would survive into adulthood depended in large part on the personalities and ambitions of the generals, as well as the efforts of their opponents to stop them. But first we must return to the deathbed of Constantine VII on the 9th of November 959, and to the Cretan expedition that was then in the works, and to the man who would lead it, Nikephoros Phokas. His name meant bringer of victory, though he would come to be known by a far more famous epithet, the Pale Death of the Saracens. His life thus far had been spent living up to those ideals, as both a bringer of victory and a bane of the Muslims, and he hoped to live up to them again in Crete. He was a soldier through and through, yet deeply religious, being both vegetarian and celibate, and enjoying nothing more than a debate with monks. He always promised that one day he would withdraw to a monastery and live out his days in perfect seclusion, but alas, he never did. As the empire's top general, he was always too busy. But Nikephoros was not the only figure on the stage, and it is worth getting to know the people of this period. There was the wider Phokas family, his brother Leo and his father Bardas, as well as his intrepid nephew John Tzimiskes. Although Bardas, who was now in his 70s, would not be leading armies anymore, all three had roles to play in the first power struggle of the 960s. In Constantinople, two powerful eunuchs held considerable influence, Joseph Bringas and a certain Basil Lekepenos. If you have watched some of my prior videos on this period, then the name Lekepenos will ring a bell. Basil was the illegitimate eunuch son of Emperor Romanos I Lekepenos, who had reigned from 920 to 944. This meant that Basil was actually a relative of the ruling dynasty. Both eunuchs were influential, but after 959 Joseph's power at court eclipsed that of Basil, despite the latter's imperial blood. That year the office of Parakimomenos passed from Basil to Joseph. Parakimomenos translates roughly to Chamberlain, which doesn't sound impressive, but it conferred great influence because it allowed access to, and implied the supreme confidence of, the emperor. Speaking of the emperor, the new ruler of Byzantium was Romanos II, young, handsome and popular. His wife, Theophano, was an interesting figure in her own right. Many sources say she was the daughter of an innkeeper, a beautiful low-born woman who Romanos II married on impulse, although one more favourable source says she was of aristocratic birth. The image of Theophano as a domineering schemer is an enduring one, but recent historians have come to doubt how involved in politics she actually was. In 958, the happy couple were blessed with a son, Basil. 2 years later he was followed by a second, named Constantine after his grandfather. Both, as sons of the emperor, bore the honour of being purple-born. Enthusiasm for his reign was high, though in truth Romanos spent most of it hunting and living it up in the capital. The emperor's personal laziness was not necessarily a bad thing though, since it allowed the extremely capable team surrounding him to get to work. Aside from a minor famine in 960, these years were a time of plenty, and of conquest. Under the able stewardship of Joseph Bringas, the preparations for the conquest of Crete continued apace. We have no reliable numbers for the force assembled, but it was certainly large enough to leave other flanks of the empire exposed. The task force assembled at Figula on the western coast of Anatolia, and by late June or early July 960, it was ready. With Nikephoros at its head, it set sail and made landfall on Crete on the 13th of July. The subsequent campaign was confused but certainly hard fought. The Byzantines laid siege to the capital of the island, Chandax, while Muslim forces elsewhere launched guerrilla attacks against the invaders, raiding and then running away. Initial attempts to storm Chandax failed, and so a long siege loomed. Conditions were grim inside the city and out, especially as summer gave way to autumn, and then autumn to winter. At a low point, one large foraging party was led into an ambush and wiped out. Nikephoros stood fast and kept things under control, inspiring his men with his unshakable courage and energy. The general himself, as a thoroughly devout man, had his spirits buoyed by the arrival of his monkish friends at camp. But it was not just in Crete that imperial forces were hard pressed. The concentration of so many soldiers for the invasion had left other fronts denuded of defenders, a golden opportunity for the Emir of Aleppo, Saif al-Dawla, to attack. The Emir wasted no time, sending a diversionary force to invade Armenia, while he himself went for the region of Charcianon, roughly in the middle of the front line. Perhaps as many as 30,000 men marched under Saif's banner, a mighty host indeed. And to face it, the commander of the east, Leo Phokas, the brother of Nikephoros, had few resources. There was naught he could do but avoid battle, so Saif al-Dawla cut into the empire, plundering and raiding to his heart's content. When all was said and done, huge trains of loot snaked behind Saif al-Dawla's army, and he began his return journey in high spirits, cheerfully riding about and tossing his lance up into the air before catching it again. The passes of the Taurus range were clear, or so it seemed. On the 8th of November, Saif entered one, and at once a trumpet blast rang out, and boulders span down the sides of the pass. And suddenly the army of Leo Phokas was attacking from all sides, slaughtering without compunction. Caught with his caftan down, Saif fought fiercely but in vain. His army was lost and his horse was slain beneath him. Only by taking his servants did he escape, bloodied and bruised, back to Aleppo. Even now Byzantium could still defend itself. When exactly Nikephoros learned of his brother's triumph is unclear. He himself was still staring up at the walls of Chandax. That winter food supplies were squeezed by an empire-wide shortage, and they began to run dangerously low in the Byzantine camps outside Chandax. There was the real possibility that the besiegers would starve before the besieged did. But despite it all, Joseph Bringas worked to get a shipment of supplies through. Led by the dauntless Nikephoros, the Byzantines survived the winter, and in February 961 they finally received resupply. With their bellies full, they steeled themselves for the last push. There was no such luck for the defenders, whose frantic appeals to the Muslims of Spain, Egypt and Sicily went unanswered. Finally, on the 6th of March, a section of the wall collapsed, and the attackers poured in. It was over. The siege had lasted 8 months, but after more than a century, Byzantine banners were flying over Crete once again. Twice now the empire had triumphed, and the sense of jubilation in the capital was matched only by the sense that the Byzantines should press their advantage. Nikephoros returned to the capital and celebrations were held for him in the manner of old. He walked in the hippodrome to the thunderous applause of the people, but soon Emperor Romanus sent him east again to make war against Saif al-Dawla, who continued to make trouble despite his defeat. His forces defeated a Byzantine ally in Armenia, but by mid-961 Nikephoros was on his way. Cilicia, the fertile land which led to Syria, was to be the target of Nikephoros' attacks. For centuries it had been subject to the rhythmic raids of border warfare, Each year for centuries, towns and farms were plundered to undermine morale and destroy livelihoods. The invading forces on both sides always withdrew afterwards, but now that the Eastern Romans were ascendant, their armies were bigger, better equipped, and ready to occupy these lands. But old habits die hard, and conquest did not take place immediately. Instead, the Byzantines would first lead a series of punitive raids to destroy the food supply and soften up their main targets. Only once they were weak would they finally annex a region. Towns were savaged and fertile fields scoured clean in order to clear the ground for conquest. Over the course of this initial campaign, numerous battles were fought against the city of Anazabus. It's also worth mentioning that while Saif-al-Dawla theoretically controlled Cilicia, his influence was tenuous. He was also still reeling from his prior thrashing at the hands of Leo Phokas, and may have been trying to sign a temporary truce with the empire. Unsurprisingly, the frontline cities were horrified. They thought that Saif-al-Dawla was cutting them loose. A quick glance at the map will highlight the sheer imbalance of power between the two sides, and Saif-al-Dawla knew well that he was very much swimming upstream. In any case, Nikephoros took Anazabus by February 962 and destroyed its walls, and then defeated the forces of Tarsus before briefly returning to Caesarea to celebrate Easter. During Nikephoros' absence, Saif-al-Dawla tried to restore the situation in Cilicia, rebuilding the walls of Anazabus, but in doing so he left Aleppo unguarded. It was an error that Nikephoros was quick to exploit. A stunning blitzkrieg saw the Byzantines sweep down on Syria, sacking Manbij in November and Aleppo in December. The citadel of Aleppo remained defiant, but that frankly was beside the point. Saif-al-Dawla, whose very title meant Sword of the Dynasty, had seen his capital sacked and brutalised, his credibility shattered. The sword of jihad had been blunted, and he would face revolts for the rest of his life. By contrast, the sacking of Aleppo caused Nikephoros' star to burn brighter than ever before, which was just as well, because as he returned victorious from the campaign, word came from the capital that the emperor was dead. The unfortunate death of Romanus II and the ascent of his infant sons to the throne on the 15th of March 963 must have left some of the older folk in the capital with a sense of déjà vu, for it mirrored exactly the situation of Constantine VII, whose own father had died when he was just 7, some 50 years ago. Regency after regency had followed as military men vied for power. No one at court wanted a repeat of that, so Nikephoros' next steps were watched warily. Meanwhile, moves were taken to shore up support for the youths. Polyeuctos, the Patriarch of Constantinople, arranged for the public acclamation of the new rulers, Basil and Constantine, alongside their mother Theophano, while the industrious chief minister, Joseph Bringas, got ready to welcome Nikephoros to the capital. Generals returning from war were innately dangerous men, but Bringas had cause for hope. For starters, Nikephoros was returning without his army. If he aimed to make a play for the throne, why would he bother returning? His arrival in April was greeted with mingled joy and anticipation. His triumph went ahead, and Joseph Bringas confirmed him as Commander-in-Chief of the East. Traditionally, Joseph Bringas is painted as the aggressor here, the man who tried to blind Nikephoros and block his triumph. But things probably did not come to a head so suddenly. Where distrust did exist, it did not boil over into conflict. Joseph had to tread carefully, nursing Nikephoros' ambitions while not indulging them fully to avoid a civil war. A civil war which Nikephoros would, in all likelihood, win. Much gossip swirls around this period in history. Supposedly, Nikephoros fell passionately in love with Empress Theophano, the mother of the emperors, and the two began to exchange letters plotting Bringas' downfall. The truth of this is doubtful, and indeed the empress came to be accused of much by history, of poisoning Constantine VII, of poisoning Romanus II, and so forth, crimes which can safely be discounted. Nikephoros returned to the company of his fellow generals, men like John Tzimiskes in Cappadocia, and it was there, at their urging, that his armies proclaimed him emperor on the 2nd of July. Perhaps he came away from his time in the capital suspicious of Bringus's motives, or encouraged by his own rapturous reception. Perhaps he was simply tired of serving others. Either way, it would be civil war. Joseph Bringus was furious, but with typical energy the eunuch sprang into action. A troop of Macedonians led by Marianos Argyros was drafted into the capital, but the odds were stacked against them. Not only could Nikephoros draw on the armies of the east, but he enjoyed the adoration of Constantinople's people, forcing an increasingly desperate Bringus to play dirty. He hunted the Phokas family down, with the aim of using them as hostages. Leo fled the city in disguise, but Nikephoros' aged father Bardas could not. Instead, the 83-year-old threw himself into the Hagia Sophia, there to claim sanctuary. Bringus then made his first serious error, and ordered his men to force their way in. An angry mob assembled to protect the old man and the sanctity of their greatest monument. Thwarted, Bringus went to talk to the Patriarch of Constantinople, but another mob assembled to protest. Now Bringus had many skills, but being likeable was not one of them. Foolishly, he threatened the crowd, saying he would starve the capital if they did not relent. At this provocation, their fury spiralled into a full-blown riot. In the confusion, Marianos Argyros was killed, Pyrrhus-style, by a woman who threw some pottery at him from a nearby roof. Nikephoros was proclaimed emperor by the people, and to add insult to injury, Basil Lecapenus, Bringus's old rival at court, burned down his mansion. Nikephoros watched all this, presumably with a smile on his face, from the other side of the Bosphorus, and sailed into the city to be proclaimed co-emperor on the 16th of August. Joseph Bringus was finished. He was exiled to Paphlagonia, while his title of Parakimomenos was handed over to Basil Lecapenus, whose actions during the riots had not gone unnoticed. Nikephoros rewarded his other supporters with other offices, and then, on the 20th of September, he married Empress Theophano, in a move to unite his house with the ruling Macedonians. A less well-matched couple is hard to imagine. Nikephoros was a joyless and supposedly fairly ugly ascetic who never ate meat and slept on the floor in a hair shirt. Theophano was an empress who had spent the past 4 years at the world's most luxurious court, and was 3 decades his junior besides. But politics was politics, and Nikephoros swore to protect the young emperors Basil and Constantine. Any objections to the marriage were swiftly silenced. With his coup d'etat complete, Nikephoros could return to what he did best, war, which broke out on 2 fronts. In the east, the endless rhythm of raid and counter-raid continued, while imperial attention was also drawn to a Sicilian sideshow involving the island's last Christian holdout, Rometta. Besieged by Muslim forces, the town begged for Byzantine assistance, which arrived in 964, only to be swiftly destroyed, leading to the fall of Rometta the following year. So that was that. Anyway, Nikephoros had bigger fish to fry in the east. It was a year into his reign before he could go east again, but in that time Saif al-Dawla suffered a stroke, and John Tzimiskes crushed the Cilicians in battle. When Nikephoros finally returned in 964, he kept up the pressure by savaging the towns of the frontier. The stage was set for 965, the decisive year. Firstly, Cyprus was reabsorbed. The island had hitherto been ruled jointly by the Byzantines and Muslims, but was majority Christian, and if there was any resistance to the imperial takeover, it was soon annihilated. Then came Cilicia. The local cities knew what was coming for them, and sued for peace with the emperor, who contemptuously rejected their offers and promised them only the sword. Nikephoros, Tzimiskes and Leo all invaded the region in an overwhelming display of force. Nothing could withstand them, and their progress culminated in the fall of Tarsus on the 17th of August. Depressingly for the Tarsiotes, an Egyptian relief fleet had been just 3 days away from the city when it fell. But even had it arrived in time, the outcome would not have been any different. The wave of conquest could not be stopped from crashing down. Saif al-Dawla, whose emirate had been rocked by revolt ever since the sack of Aleppo in 962, and whose body had been ruined by a stroke, could do little. When thousands of Central Asian warriors turned up for jihad, he was simply unable to pay them, and they dispersed. Nikephoros celebrated another triumph in October in the knowledge that something fundamental was finished. Since the earliest days of Muslim conquest, the Eastern Front constituted a contested wasteland. Without fail, forces from beyond would come to raid, to carry out the duty of jihad, and the Byzantines of course returned the favour. Elaborate systems of fortresses, termed al-Thugur in Arabic, provided staging grounds for the Muslim attacks. Only now those fortresses were gone. Every year raids had come, and then the counter-raids went, both sides tearing strips out of each other for centuries. A battle rhythm lasting so long that it branded itself onto the Byzantine mind. New genres of literature were left in its wake, like the so-called acritic poems, works which documented the wild life of the frontiers in all its dangerous glamour. The most famous of which was the story of Digenes Akritas, more than 4,000 lines long. But Byzantine dominance brought that world to an end. Not only had the balance of power changed, warfare had too. Tit-for-tat skirmishes gave way to larger campaigns, the primarily defensive outlook of the 8th century replaced by more aggressive strategies. Inner Anatolia, no longer on the front lines, enjoyed an economic revival for the next century. Indeed, the region was not contested again until the arrival of the Turks. This is all to say that 965 was a good year for the Byzantines, but the glory of conquest was not shared equally, and indeed some suffered for their success. John Tzimiskes, the emperor's nephew, played a prominent role in these wars. After Nikephoros' coup d'etat, he served as commander-in-chief of the East, but suddenly fell out of favour in 965. He was stripped of his commands and sent packing to his estates in Anatolia. Had he offended the emperor or done something to wrong him? It's not clear, but John was a gifted general and famous for his courage and charisma. All of his exploits thus far had led to success, so perhaps Nikephoros felt envious or endangered. It would not be the last time he fired a top general after a great victory. In any case, the show carried on without Tzimiskes. But wheels increasingly began to fall off the emperor's bandwagon. The Eastern Wars calmed down after a punitive raid in 966, but new problems distracted and undermined the emperor, problems which he could not simply besiege or raid or stab. As such, they were poorly handled. Emperors like Nikephoros had to be both generals and politicians, and for all his skill as a general, he was a simply atrocious politician. First and foremost among his woes was unpopularity. Enthusiasm for his rule had ebbed since his coup d'etat back in 963. This was due to a few things, but the most important was simple: taxes. His wars didn't pay for themselves, so the people were squeezed for cash. The further his reign progressed, the worse this became. And Nikephoros was never good with gratitude. Instead, he treated the people with contempt and billeted his soldiers on them. In 967, a brawl broke out in Constantinople involving some of Nikephoros' Armenian soldiers. Many locals were killed, yet Nikephoros let his soldiers off the hook. A woman in the capital publicly heckled the emperor in the street. He responded by having her burned at the stake. Hatred and fear were the inevitable results. When Nikephoros held a mock military display in Constantinople's Hippodrome, the people feared that he was about to attack them for real. Panic spread through the crowd, people pushing past each other to escape, and in the chaos many thousands were caught in a crush. Thousands died under the feet of their countrymen, and it was only after the chaos subsided that people realised nothing was happening. The soldiers remained where they stood. Nikephoros, for his part, never bothered getting up from where he was sitting. He simply watched things in disbelief, shaking his head. Needless to say, none of this endeared the emperor to his people. Several people cursed him to his face, calling him a murderer. The mood in the capital got increasingly ugly. but Nikephoros was as tactless as ever. He simply built a wall around the palace, blocking the rest of Constantinople out. And just as he was alienating the people, the emperor was also picking a fight with the church. That might seem strange given his personal piety, but in his eyes the church was failing on two fronts. Both stemmed from the wealth of the church. Firstly, the wealth of the monasteries in Anatolia offended the ascetic emperor. Somewhat justifiably, he saw it as a mockery of Christian virtue. Secondly, much of the land on monastic estates was not being used properly or at all. As such, it was going to waste. To combat this, he forbade people from donating land to monasteries, cancelled past subsidies to them, meddled in church affairs, and repossessed some church wealth. At one point, he caustically commented that poverty suited the monks better. Apparently, he even demanded that the church recognise slain soldiers as martyrs, foreshadowing the later absolution of sin granted to crusaders by the Pope, much to the chagrin of the Patriarch. However, the veracity of that last story is debatable. In short, Nikephoros made a mess of things in the capital. No doubt he wished to return to the soldier's life that he had lived before taking the throne. In 968, the emperor's father, Basil Phokas, finally passed away at the age of 90, leaving Nikephoros prostrate with grief. Adding to the pressures he already felt as a ruler, this personal blow cut him deep and left him more irascible than ever. In July 968 he would return east to take advantage of chaos in Syria, but before that two diplomatic crises detained him in Constantinople. Relations with the empire's major European competitors, namely Bulgaria and Germany, broke down simultaneously after many years of peace. And because it's a small world, events in Germany indirectly spurred on conflict with Bulgaria. The Magyars, that is the Hungarians, were the terror of much of Europe in the 10th century. Italy, Germany, France, even Spain, all had tales to tell of these terrifying pagans. Then, in 955, King Otto I of Germany defeated them so thoroughly at the Battle of Lechfeld that they never again menaced Western Europe. Instead, they turned east. Warbands began crossing the Danube with increasing frequency, hoping to make their fortunes by plundering Bulgaria and Byzantium. To add insult to injury, Tsar Peter of Bulgaria likely agreed to start letting them pass unhindered in return for peace, straight through to imperial territory. For Nikephoros this was naturally unacceptable, but he also planned to take his armies east soon. So in 967 he paid someone else to punish Peter, with the attack set to come in 968. For the task, Nikephoros selected the most fearsome warlord of the north, Prince Sviatoslav of Kiev. His huge multi-ethnic empire already stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and he was all too happy to accept Byzantine money to make it bigger still. Just a few years ago he had destroyed and conquered the Khazars, adding their lands to his. From this massive empire, Sviatoslav levied a diverse army of Slavs, Pechenegs, Magyars and more, tens of thousands of them, and they were all sailing south. Although Nikephoros did not immediately realise the scope of his error, he soon would. He wanted to solve the problem of barbarians riding south, and he had just invited tens of thousands of barbarians to march south, across the Danube just a few hundred miles from imperial territory. This was a short-sighted blunder. More than that, it was Nikephoros at his strategic worst. Needless to say, Sviatoslav wasted no time, striking like a bolt of lightning. The Bulgars were crushed in battle and saw their capital fall. Only at the last moment were they saved, not by the Byzantines, but by the tribes of the steppe, who attacked Sviatoslav's capital. The Rus war machine ground to a halt as Sviatoslav hurried home, but he would be back. Just as the Bulgarian fiasco was spinning out of control in 968, the Germans attacked. 1 year before Nikephoros' own rise to power, another emperor had been crowned in Europe, Otto of Saxony. Prior to 962, the Western imperial title had actually fallen into abeyance. No one had been powerful enough to stake their claim to it, but as the most powerful Western king, Otto breathed new life into it. Henceforth, it would always be associated in some way with Germany. The return of emperors to the west raised anew the spectre of conflict between them and the Eastern Romans, who understandably took a dim view of barbarians who larped as the heirs of Rome. Conversely, Otto was keen to establish his imperial credentials and get some form of recognition from Constantinople. He decided upon a course of war, yet both empires were too far apart, save for in Italy, so it was here that they came to blows. Otto hoped to extract not only recognition but also a Byzantine bride for his son, so he cranked up the pressure. First, he won the support of Pandulf Ironhead, the Duke of Capua and Benevento. Then the Western Emperor invaded Apulia in 968. Though Nikephoros could not spare the men for an Italian war, Otto achieved nothing and failed to crack the defences of Bari. Switching tack, Otto now tried to cajole diplomatic concessions from Nikephoros. In return for a bride for his son, Otto would give Apulia back, despite not actually controlling it. Nikephoros was unamused, and all of Otto's proposals were quickly put in the shredder. The Western Emperor had just spent the past year throwing stones at his window, and here he was demanding an imperial bride. This was mockery. Sarcastically, he told Otto's ambassador that he would agree to the request after all, so long as Otto agreed to hand over all of Italy and Dalmatia. Negotiations went nowhere, and more time was spent arguing about cultural differences. An offensive letter from the Pope, which called Nikephoros Emperor of the Greeks, only inflamed him further. Sick and tired of the wrangling, Nikephoros decided to join his army in the east in July 968, showing that he didn't really see the Germans as much of a threat, and planned a fresh round of conquest. Otto launched further ineffectual strikes in 969, this time on Calabria, but again he made little progress and withdrew empty-handed. Pandulf Ironhead, the Duke of Capua and Otto's ally in the south, stayed behind to keep up the pressure, but was defeated and captured by the Byzantines. Italy quietened down thereafter, but the situation had never been serious enough to draw Nikephoros away from Syria. Since we last checked, Saif al-Dawla had died. In his wake, civil war paralysed the Hamdanid Emirate of Aleppo. No leaders emerged to replace him, and when Nikephoros invaded Syria in October 968, he faced no opposition. His army raided and pillaged as far as Tripoli, then he turned his attention to Antioch. Once upon a time it had ranked among the most important cities in the world, the capital of an ancient empire that stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the banks of the Indus River. Those days were long gone. Antioch was a shriveled husk, but still the walls stood basically as they had done when they were first built, huge and mighty and impregnable. Taking it would be a crucial stepping stone for further conquest, so Nikephoros paved the way by building a fortress outside Antioch to control the terrain, and then he left his general, Michael Bortzes, to besiege the city with 1,500 men. That done, he left for home. Going into 969, it probably began to dawn on Nikephoros that the situation in Bulgaria was not getting better. Peter of Bulgaria had a stroke and died on the 30th of January 969, to be succeeded by his son, Boris II. Sadly, Boris was no better placed to save his country than his father, and the Rus bore down on the Bulgars relentlessly. Philippopolis fell late in the year, and Sviatoslav impaled thousands of the defenders. Apparently, Nikephoros asked Boris for the hands of his two daughters in marriage to the boy emperors Basil and Constantine, who were now 11 and 9 respectively, and there was little that Boris could do but save his family by sending them to Constantinople. Despite the engagements, it seems that neither of these marriages went ahead. By now, most of eastern Bulgaria was under Sviatoslav's control, bringing the two empires face to face in Thrace. An Eastern Roman response would be necessary, as Sviatoslav did not seem to be going anywhere. In fact, he planned to relocate permanently to the Danube, because in his words, "This is the centre of my realm, where all riches are concentrated. Gold, silks, wine, and various fruits from Greece. silver and horses from Hungary and Bohemia, and from the Rus, furs, wax, honey and slaves. An unexpected bit of good news came from Antioch. The city had fallen. Michael Bortzes, the man the emperor had left to blockade the city, managed to bribe some of the defenders and snuck into the city on the 28th of October, 969. Initially the defenders fought back and Bortzes was pinned atop the walls of Antioch. But after receiving reinforcements, the Antiochenes broke and Bortzes had the glory he craved. He rushed back to deliver the good news, where he was immediately stripped of his command by an angry Nikephoros. Different explanations are given for this, that he believed in a prophecy that he would die when the city fell, or that he was angry about fire damage to the city. It was probably just a case of jealousy, I'd say. 1,500 men should not have been enough to take a city as big as Antioch, so when Nikephoros left them there, he was probably not expecting anything immediate. But now Bortzes had stolen Nikephoros' thunder, much to his own sorrow. The emperor cared little for Michael's broken ego, and dismissed him with a wave of the hand. War with the Rus was looming after all. He had bigger fish to fry, so he paid it no mind. Michael Bortzes was not the first successful general that Nikephoros had dismissed for being a bit too good. John Tzimiskes, the emperor's nephew, had similarly fallen out of favour in 965 after a period of success. Speaking of John, he had actually escaped exile and was now back in the capital. This was largely down to the Empress's influence. Sometime after his exile, Empress Theophano had pleaded with Nikephoros to permit John's return. Somewhat surprisingly, the flinty emperor relented. Why exactly Theophano did this is unclear, but if we believe the most scandalous details, then she was in love with John. One recent historian has doubted that the toxin of treachery actually spread to Theophano, but if true, her betrayal proved fateful. On the night of the 10th of December, Nikephoros was tipped off that there were conspirators in the palace, lying in wait. However, when the emperor's chief eunuch was sent to scour the palace, nothing untoward was found. Little did the emperor know that his eunuch was part of the plot as well. Earlier on the snowy, blustery night of the 10th, Theophano had left their chambers. To check on the visiting Bulgarian princesses, she said, crucially leaving the door unlocked. The empress never returned, but the emperor thought nothing of it and went to sleep on his panther skin rug. A noise woke him in the small hours of the morning. When he tried to rise, cold steel slapped his face and knocked him down. Slick with his own blood, he cried out to the Virgin Mary as strong hands dragged him across the floor, towards the bed he never slept in, where John Tzimiskes sat, motionless. Nikephoros slumped to the floor before him, unable to stand. Infuriated, Tzimiskes kicked his uncle and ripped at his hair, cursing him and his ingratitude. Then came the others. Bortzes was there, but he was just one of a handful of army officers, nursing a grudge against the emperor, and they all took turns getting even with him, until at last someone took out a sword, ran him through, and relieved him of his head. The conspirators moved quickly in the ensuing confusion. Across the city, criers proclaimed John, Emperor and Augustus of the Romans, to rapturous applause, utterly blindsiding the Phokas faction. Leo, the slain emperor's brother, lost his nerve and fled to the Hagia Sophia. Not only could John count on the support of the people, who were happy to see Nikephoros go, and his own military connections, but Basil Lecapenus, the Parakimomenos, was lending John his support too. However, it should be noted that Lecapenus was acting to preserve the Macedonian dynasty, so he had his men shout in support of the boy emperors as well. Nikephoros' mutilated body was dumped in the street, his head raised on a spear. When the palace guards saw this, they immediately gave in and offered no resistance, allowing John to claim the prize he had played so foully for. Nevertheless, Emperor John I was careful not to step on his newfound colleagues' toes. When, on that snowy December morning, he climbed the steps to the throne, he did so alongside the boy emperors Basil and Constantine. Though still young, they were beloved by the people, and John promised to guard them until they came of age. As such, he was mimicking Nikephoros in every way except one. The Empress Mother Theophano, whom Nikephoros had married, was exiled shortly after John became emperor. If the two were lovers, why the sudden switch-up? Well, murdering emperors was grisly work, and John needed a scapegoat far more than he needed a lover. In fact, Patriarch Polyeuctos said that he would only crown John after Nikephoros' murderers were punished. Thus Theophano was lumped with the blame and packed off to a monastery. But if we are to talk of blame, the true heart of the conspiracy lies with the group of army officers, men like John Tzimiskes and Michael Botzes, among others, whom Nikephoros had alienated. Other figures in the capital, who felt that Nikephoros was losing his grip, then joined. This included Theophano and Basil Lekepenos. The Patriarch also placed two other conditions on the coronation. Firstly, that John reverse all of Nikephoros' church policies, and secondly, that he donate half of his wealth to charity, something which John, as a naturally open-handed man, was more than happy to do. Indeed, now that he was ensconced on the throne, the normally cheerful John was having second thoughts about the brutal way in which he had disposed of his predecessor. The mangled remains of Nikephoros, his uncle and former brother-in-arms, were scooped up and laid to rest in the mausoleum of the Holy Apostles. It was a grim way to go, but Byzantine politics tended not to let unpopular rulers down gently. The Phokades that remained were dealt with more generously. Leo and his eldest son were exiled to Lesbos, while his youngest son Bardas was imprisoned in the Armenia Theme. The situation in the Balkans was quickly worsening, but John could not leave for the front lines until his own position was secure. He appointed Bardas Skleros, a prominent army officer and also John's brother-in-law, as his chief general to balance out the residual influence of the Phokas family, igniting a rivalry between Skleros and the Phokades that was only put to rest 2 decades later. In early 970, after failing to solve the crisis diplomatically, John sent Skleros with over 10,000 men to stabilise the situation in Bulgaria and prevent any further Rus advances. Despite the offer of gold from John, Sviatoslav would not evacuate Bulgaria with his forces, and John could not accept the presence of so powerful and aggressive a neighbour. So war became inevitable. Sviatoslav was now forcing Tsar Boris II of Bulgaria to fight alongside him, adding another useful contingent to an army that already consisted of northern Slavs, Pechenegs and Magyars, to name but a few. Skleros first came to blows with a part of this huge army in March, near the town of Arkadiopolis. Skleros had the expressed orders of John to avoid battle if at all possible, but the force was riding south towards Constantinople, so he decided to engage. Skleros's 10,000 was outnumbered by the enemy, who counted Bulgarians and Pechenegs amongst their ranks, but not hugely. This was only a small part of Sviatoslav's forces. Skleros decided to deal with them by means of an ambush. The Pechenegs were horse-riding nomads from the steppe, faster and more agile than their fellow warriors, but less disciplined. These he identified as the weak link in the enemy army. To isolate them, Skleros split his army in 3. 2 divisions hid themselves in a forest on either side of the road, while a third rode out to challenge the Rus and draw off the Pecheneg contingent. Happily, the Pechenegs took the bait, riding further and further ahead of the others. The fleeing Byzantines turned to charge their pursuers now and again to keep them close, until at last they ran them straight into the ambush. From all sides imperial forces streamed around the Pechenegs and massacred them to a man, striking fear into the hearts of the rest of the Rus army, which could only watch as the Byzantines killed their comrades and then came for them too. The remainder of the battle was bloody for the Rus, especially for the Bulgarians fighting under them, and Skleros emerged victorious. Later traditions hyped up the Battle of Arkadiopolis as a huge victory, but most of Sviatoslav's forces were not present, and it would take a lot more to finally defeat him. Even so, the Rus did not menace Thrace again for the rest of 970. This was a perfect opportunity to press their advantage, until dark news from Asia robbed the imperial forces of all momentum. Basil Phokas, the son of Leo and nephew of Nikephoros, had risen in revolt and proclaimed himself emperor at Caesarea. He was relying on his family's military links to establish himself on the throne, and to make things worse, Leo himself had escaped captivity on Lesbos and was making his way to join his son. John was decisive as usual, quickly capturing Leo before he could do much and sentencing him to death. Generously, the emperor then reduced the sentence to blinding, and then, even more generously, entirely pardoned him and sent him back to Lesbos. To deal with Basil Phokas, John recalled Skleros from Europe and sent him against the usurper. The clash between the two Bardises would only be the first in a long-running rivalry between them, one which would see them come to blows several times over the decades. For now, it was Skleros who gained the upper hand. Firstly, he sent agents to bribe several sections of Phokas's army, and as support for the usurper was leached away, he fled to the fort of Tyropion. A brief siege ensued, but once the food ran out and Skleros promised to spare his life, Phokas gave in. As with Leo, so it was with Basil. The emperor treated him mercifully and exiled him to Chios as a monk, where he would quietly reside until fate called on him again. The civil war of 970 was a bit of a nothing burger, truth be told, but it had kept imperial forces distracted for the rest of the year, preventing further progress against Sviatoslav. The challenge to his authority led John to marry Theodora, the sister of Romanus II, who had lived her life up until now in a monastery, thereby connecting John by blood to the imperial dynasty. The imperial marriages didn't end there though, and John negotiated with Western Emperor Otto I to bring a lasting concord between the two states. Otto's demands remained the same, an imperial bride for his son and heir, also called Otto. John was happy to oblige in a sense by sending him his own niece, Theophano. Some in Otto's court felt that the Western Emperor was being deliberately fobbed off with a non-imperial bride, since Theophano was not purple-born, nor was John really a member of the imperial dynasty. However, Otto eventually decided that it was the best he could hope for, and so the marriage went ahead on the 14th of April 972. Meanwhile, John finally had a free hand to attack Sviatoslav himself, now that his domestic position was secure. The campaign of 971 would prove to be decisive. Before setting off to confront Sviatoslav, John prayed and paraded holy relics in Constantinople, hoping to secure divine blessing for his undertakings. Once done, he went down to the docks where the imperial fleet was assembled, and where he gave the order. They would sail to and blockade the mouth of the Danube to prevent Sviatoslav's seaborne escape. The emperor himself would go by land, at the head of the imperial army, and destroy the Slavic adventurer. He set off in spring, either late March or early April. Sviatoslav had established his headquarters at Doristolon, also known as Silistra, on the banks of the Danube, but John's first target was Preslav, the capital of Bulgaria. Inexplicably, Sviatoslav had left the mountain passes undefended, the same passes which had borne witness to the complete annihilation of a Byzantine army in 811, allowing John to swoop in unopposed. He split his army in two, marching ahead with his elite infantry and cavalry and catching his foes by surprise. A fierce battle ensued outside the Bulgarian capital, leaving 850 Rus corpses scattered beneath the walls of Preslav, before they were finally bottled up inside. Desperate messengers tried to summon Sviatoslav from Doristolon, but the rest of the imperial army, led by Basil Lekepenos, arrived the following day, allowing John to bombard Preslav with siege weapons. In short order, this withering maelstrom of stone shattered the defences, while John cleared the citadel by firing its wooden palisades. Thousands, both Russian and Bulgarian, had perished in the firestorm, but among the survivors was Tsar Boris of Bulgaria. John took him and his family captive, cynically telling them that he planned not to conquer Bulgaria, but to set it free from its pagan oppressors. Certainly, Boris had cause to doubt John's sincerity, especially after John renamed Preslav to Ioannopolis, the city of John. Bulgaria was merely exchanging one master for another. In all this time, Sviatoslav had sat tight at Dorystolon, so John resolved to root him out once and for all. Marching out from Preslav after the 16th of April, he swung north towards the Prince of Kiev, who finally grew a pair and met John in battle on the 23rd of April. It was the first face-off between Sviatoslav and an Eastern Roman emperor, and despite heavy losses, the empire triumphed once more. Battered and bruised, the Rus holed themselves up in Dorystolon, only to find the noose drawn tightly around them. The imperial fleet already had command of the Danube and now moved to blockade the town. Inside, tensions were running high. Some days earlier, Sviatoslav had already massacred 300 Bulgarian nobles, either due to rage or distrust. Now the odds were so firmly stacked against them, the Rus did not feel they could trust anyone anymore, and so began ruthlessly persecuting the natives. Their counterattacks were stopped in their tracks, so the Rus resigned themselves to a siege that began on the 24th of April. Despite his relative inaction up until now, Sviatoslav put up a ferocious defence, as he had to, given the dire circumstances. He had ditches dug around the walls, hindering the besiegers' advance, while on a dark and stormy night he seized the moment to attack the Romans by the river. Caught by surprise, many Byzantines fell, much to the fury of John. He ordered the city invested more tightly than before. Even while this was going on, the Phokas family returned to make more trouble for John for the last time. Leo Phokas had slipped his guards once more and set out for the capital, intent on unseating John while he was away. Unfortunately for him, he was out of luck. The local admiral arrested Leo and had him blinded, putting his career to an end. It was grim and inglorious, but not entirely undeserved. Staring out from the battlements of Dorystolon, Sviatoslav knew his time was nearly up. For nearly 3 months, imperial forces had bombarded the city with siege weapons, while the food stocks slowly drained away. The Rus had fended off every Byzantine attack until now, but something was bound to give. So in July, Sviatoslav gave the order for one final attack. With a desperate charge, they would snap the imperial lines or die in the attempt. The impact of the charge was devastating and sent some Byzantine units reeling back, but through a feigned retreat John destroyed the remainder of Sviatoslav's forces. Supposedly over 15,000 Rus lay dead on the field of battle, but Sviatoslav was not among them. Even he knew when he was beaten, and as he watched thousands of his tired and hungry men perish before his very eyes, he knew that the game was up. Sviatoslav sued for peace on the banks of the Danube. Prince met Emperor in a scene that the Russian painter Klavdiy Lebedev would one day bring to life in his vivid painting. Dressed in all white with a single earring, Sviatoslav rode to the shoreline, while the Emperor, adorned in his usual magnificence, rode down on a horse. The conversation that followed was pleasant but short. Sviatoslav swore by the pagan gods Perun and Veles never to attack Byzantium again. In return, and to ensure that the Rus left Bulgaria as swiftly as possible, John gave them food and safe conduct across the Danube. But despite John's promises, Sviatoslav would not live to see his homeland again. A gang of angry Pechenegs accosted him on his way home. They had fought in his Grand Armée before its destruction at Byzantine hands, and now they demanded their pay, except there was none. Sviatoslav told them as much. The spoils of war tended not to go to the losers after all. This did not please the Pechenegs, who satisfied themselves by turning Sviatoslav's skull into a drinking cup. The northern menace had been destroyed, yet John had done much more than simply protect the empire from Sviatoslav. Much of eastern Bulgaria, supposedly liberated from the Rus, lay under Byzantine control. New provinces were created to govern the conquests, and new garrisons installed to hold them. For the first time in 3 centuries, the empire had successfully restored part of the Danubian frontier. The new order of things was hammered home when John celebrated a triumph in Constantinople, modelled on those of old. At the front of the parade, a golden chariot bore an icon of the Virgin Mary along. Behind that was John himself, decked out in shining armour. Of course, the Roman triumphs of antiquity always featured defeated enemies. Now Sviatoslav was nowhere to be seen. He was soon to become a monk in any case. So instead, at the very back, Boris of Bulgaria walked alongside his family. So was he a captive? Boris was treated kindly, but not like a king. In fact, when the procession reached the Hagia Sophia, the sanctum of so many holy relics, John decreed that a few more should be added to the collection. All the royal regalia of Bulgaria was laid to rest in the church. Shortly after, Boris officially abdicated as Tsar. In theory, Bulgaria was finished. In truth, John was boasting a bit too hard. While the east had fallen, the western reaches continued to form an active core of Bulgarian resistance, and it would be these regions that fought the fiercest when Basil the Bulgar-slayer fought for 20 years to subdue the nation. Boris was allowed to live at court with a pension, while John bathed in the glory of his achievements. But the emperor's attention now shifted elsewhere. Bulgaria was not the only scene of conquest, and to the south the Fatimid Caliphate was making moves that demanded his attention. In 969, its forces had annexed Egypt, establishing the city of Cairo in the process. In 970, they advanced further into Palestine and Syria, until in October of that year a Fatimid army laid siege to Antioch. John had his hands full in Bulgaria by this time, but an imperial force was nonetheless able to drive them back. Muslim infighting paralysed the Fatimid war machine when an alliance of desert tribes descended on them and destroyed a Fatimid army. Only with great effort were Egypt and Palestine saved, but no further attacks against Byzantium were contemplated. In fact, the coming of the Fatimids eventually allowed for a new period of stability in Syria, for they and the Byzantines came to respect each other's interests, although John's reign saw continued conflict. Afterward, relations were mostly peaceful up until the Seljuks gave both empires a bloody nose in the 11th century. Elsewhere in Syria, progress had been made against the ailing emirate of Aleppo. The former seat of Saif al-Dawla had finally been brought down by persistent imperial attacks during the final days of Nikephoros II's reign. Petros, a Byzantine commander in Syria, intervened in an Aleppan civil war, and after a short siege forced the new emir to sign the Treaty of Safar in December 969 or January 970. By its terms, Aleppo handed over much of its northern territories, agreed to a defensive alliance with the empire, allowed the emperor to nominate the next emirs, and allowed imperial agents to tax trade between them. Finally, both sides agreed not to punish religious converts. Henceforth, Aleppo would serve as a bastion of imperial authority in Syria. Authority which John now hoped to expand further. In September 972, he advanced via Melitene into the Muslim lands of northern Mesopotamia. Like many others, the primary aim of this campaign was to raid and pillage rather than conquer. Nisibis fell first and was subject to a sack, while the Emir of Mosul was forced to pay John tribute before he left. Marching westward, he besieged Maya Farakin without success and then returned to imperial lands, leaving the general Melius in command. The following year, Melius tried to keep up the pressure on the Emir of Mosul, but was ambushed and captured. John does not seem to have reacted immediately to this setback. Records of his reign are frustratingly thin, but he does not seem to have campaigned in 974. 975 saw John return east for the last time in his life. The emperor had a major expedition planned, one that would see him raid, pillage and wreak havoc through Syria, with the intent of making it an easier target for conquest. John's first target was Baalbek, which he sacked on the 29th of May, followed by Damascus. When the Damascenes saw the imperial host arrive before their walls, they immediately submitted and promised John that they would pay him to leave. It took a while to scrape the money together, but eventually John got his gold, and he swung northwestward to the Levantine coast. These areas were under nominal Fatimid control, but they were too distracted to put up any resistance, giving John a free hand to enforce his power. Beirut was besieged, a situation that shocked the city of Sidon so much that it voluntarily submitted to the empire. Once Beirut had fallen, John pressed north back towards imperial land, taking Byblos on the way, but failing to crack the defences of Tripoli. Traditionally, it was believed that John Tzimiskes' grand tour of Syria included Palestine as well. Matthew of Edessa, that 12th century historian of the Crusades, purported that John's armies conquered as far as the Holy Land, Nazareth, Caesarea and Tiberias, all mere miles from Jerusalem, supposedly fell to Byzantine arms, but more recent historians have cast doubt on these claims. Most likely, he didn't go so far south. The victorious emperor, his army laden with plunder, returned to his own lands in August. Shortly after, he fell ill. Frantic messengers sped off to Constantinople to tell the stonemasons to speed up work on John's tomb. All he cared for now was to return home before he died. This he just about managed, dying in January 976. Basil Lecapenus, the chief eunuch, has often gotten the blame for this. The rumour mill was quick to turn, spreading stories that he slipped poison into John's drink. But it's more likely that John simply died of disease. The story had it though that as John was returning from the front, he passed through vast estates belonging to Basil Lecapenus, and complained that they were fighting just so a eunuch could get rich. Supposedly, when Lecapenus heard of this, he then had John poisoned. In any case, it was the eunuch who stood to benefit from John's demise. Basil II may have now been the senior emperor, ruling in his own name for the first time, but it was his great-uncle Basil Lecapenus who really held the reins of power. For the next decade, the two Basils developed an increasingly uneasy dynamic at the top, while they fended off threats to the young emperor's power. Soon enough, the two Basils would be forced to contend with the consequences of military rule. For though the Macedonian emperors were now of an age that they could rule for themselves, at least in theory, the shadow cast by the soldier emperors continued long into Basil II's reign. The first half of it would be dominated by revolts by army officers who sought to do as Nikephoros and John had done, and leverage their military influence for power. As Basil II stepped into this brave new world and got to grips for the first time with these new threats, the odyssey of his life truly began. It would take over a decade for Basil II to finally master his empire, almost losing his throne in the process, but eventually he would, and with that done he would move to capitalise on his predecessor's conquests, and raise his empire to heights not seen for nearly 500 years. Nikephoros II and John I had pushed the eastern frontier further out than at any point since the 7th century, while the half-finished annexation of Bulgaria was the biggest single conquest since the days of Justinian, although it was left to Basil II to finish the job. Fortunately, the army was in better shape than ever, and Byzantium was by far the strongest state in its neighbourhood. The stage was set for the imperial apex of Basil II's reign, the longest of any Roman emperor. If you have watched this far, then thank you very much. Producing this documentary was a Herculean effort, one that has taken me several months. But I am in a confident mood. Hopefully it does well, and even if it does not, I'll just be glad that it's done. I plan to continue this Eastern Roman tale with 2 more hour-long documentaries, and hopefully I will be able to get them out at a quicker pace. One will cover the reign of Basil II, while the other will look at the disastrous 11th century, which saw the Battle of Manzikert and Byzantium's near-total imperial collapse. You can help my channel out by liking, subscribing and commenting. Sadly, These documentaries don't pay for themselves, so becoming a member of my channel by clicking the join button on my channel page would help greatly and be much appreciated. And finally, deepest thanks to my unbelievably patient channel members, Chris Manger, Materus208 and Laktiari Nabil, who have sat tight while I made this documentary. For now though, it's goodbye from me. See you around.